Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the newsfeed tutorial series on Turbo 360. In part 1 we set up the app and scaffolded a React Redux project and installed a theme to make it look, add some quick UI and make it look presentable right away. So in this video we're going to set up the deployment infrastructure, well not the infrastructure, but set up the deployment environment and do a quick deploy to make sure everything works, and then start adding some actual news feeds to start interfacing with. So let's get into it. So now that we have our project all set up and scaffolded, and just to pick up where we left off, go ahead and run the dev server and make sure that you have this over here. I'm going to make a couple more quick UI changes. So I'm going to remove this. I'm not going to remove the search bar, but I'm going to remove the text search, and want to say feed name. And this is in the sidebar component, by the way. And feed URL. So I'm adding an input field, and then I'm going to add a button called add feed. So we can just add a feed from here. Okay, so now our UI, at least at the moment, is ready to go. Let's go ahead and deploy this to the actual environment. So go to turbo360.co, make sure it's .co, www.turbo360.co, and go ahead and sign up if you haven't already. It's free. You can do that down here. If you already have an account, go ahead and log in. And you should see this. And let's create an app, and let's call it newsfeed. Now we need this number right here to connect our local app, our app locally, to our Turbo project. So now we go back to our terminal, we do Turbo app, and that's it. And we're good to go. And let's deploy it just to make sure it works. Okay, the deployment is done. Here is our URL, our staging URL. So we just copy that and navigate over to it, and here it is. So here's our project on the live server. You'll notice that we have if you have the Chrome React plugin, it'll detect if it's a React app, and you can see it right here. Now it's giving you an orange icon because we're currently running a React development build. So if you want to get rid of that, actually, it's pretty simple. We do npm run build. The orange icon is actually not good. You want to see a blue icon. So if we're running the build script, then we're going to be compiling a build distribution package. So now we can deploy that instead. It's the same URL, but sometimes it takes a minute or two to update, but now we're good to go. See, now we're running the production build, which is better than the development build. When you deploy, you should be running the production build. So that's that. Okay, great. So the entire environment is set up. So now let's get down to brass tacks and actually start adding some feeds. So if we look at the sidebar presentation, we're going to see that we have an input for a feed name and a feed URL. So let's say I want to add New York Daily News Sports section, because I read this every day. So this is part of my list of things that I read every day. So to find the feed, we want to find the RSS feed. So we go to the view, developer, and view source, and then we do a search for either RSS, in which case it doesn't show up here, but you do another search for feed, and that's typically an RSS feed. So we click on this, and here are the RSS feeds that Daily News offers. So we just scroll down and we pick our feed. So I'm going to pick the sports feed right here and click on that. And here is the RSS feed for Daily News Sports. So if you look at the actual front page, here is the first article, something about an A-Rod, and then here is the RSS version of that same article. So we're looking at the correct feed. So what we really want to do is go back to our project, enter the feed name, so NY Daily News, I think it's actually like that, News Sports, enter the feed URL, and then press add feed, and that should create the feed on our server. So let's go ahead and set up the code to do just that. So right here, what we're going to want is a means of tracking the content that's typed into here. So let's set some state up inside the constructor. And let's add a feed object which has a name and a URL. So we're going to track what the user typed in here inside this state object right here. And then let's create an update feed with an event and a field. So whenever the user types into this input field, we're going to call that function. And we're going to add an argument right here and call that name. And then on the second one, we're going to call the same function, but call it URL, like that. And then every time the user types into the inputs, this is the function that's going to be called. And then you can see which field and the value from the event. So this will make more sense when I run it on the browser. So here, if we go back to the terminal, we want to run Webpack here, which we already are, but I'm going to just do it again anyway. And then run the dev server. And then let's go back to localhost now. And we want to open the console by doing Option Command I. And when I type into it, you'll see that the update feed function is console logging the way we had written in the code. So now that we've confirmed that this is properly coming through, let's go ahead and actually update this object. So what we want to do is copy it from the state and then we want to update the copy based on what field is being manipulated, updated. This. And then we want to reset the state. And that should update the state, the feed being maintained in here. Now I remove the console log because we're done with it. Now let's have an add feed event or click handler, and let's console log that. And then let's render the current feed from the state. Now we want to call this function whenever the user clicks this button. Now this part's pretty important. Make sure you do event, prevent, default. And here's why. Because these inputs are inside of a form tag. Let me just fix this indentation real quick. Okay. And if we do not prevent the event from going through, if we don't prevent it, it'll actually submit the form, but it'll go nowhere because the destination is nowhere. So it'll kind of mess up the UI. It's not going to be a good user experience. So by preventing the default action, nothing will happen, and it'll do whatever we tell it to do, which is basically just a console log for now. So we want to make sure we prevent it so that the form doesn't actually submit. Very, very important detail to keep in mind. So now that we have that ready, let's go back to our browser, reload the page, hello, test URL, and then add feed, and we should see it right here. And that's it. So now if I do New York Daily News Sports, and then we actually enter the feed from the Daily News, then we see it right here. So now we have all the content we need to submit a feed. So now let's go ahead and do that. So the next thing we want to do is actually send this to a backend. We're going to send this to the Turbo backend, which is essentially the project we set up right here in order to maintain some data, to get the persistent data. So what we want to do now is we want to import the Turbo client, sort of the client helper, and that comes from the package.json. It's already installed right here by scaffolding a project, and then we're going to instantiate the Turbo client by passing in the client ID, which is this value right here, which is also the same as this value right here. So whichever one you want to use is the same thing. So that's your app ID. Okay, so this Turbo client right here will act as a liaison to our Turbo backend. So now what we can do is simply call, let's check the documentation real quick because it's a lot to remember. So let's see. We are currently creating a resource. So Turbo, create the resource name. We're going to call it feed, and then we're going to pass in the feed itself, and this returns a promise almost certainly. So let's finish out the promise sequence. And let's throw an error if that happens. So, and then let's just do a console log here. Feed created. Okay. So here we have our Turbo client posting the feed to the backend, the Turbo app, and then here are the standard promise sequence. Here is the standard promise sequence. So I'm going to get rid of that console log and hope that we get this one in return. Let's see here. Okay, everything looks good. So Let me just check the documentation real quick to make sure I instantiated it. Yep, site ID. So that's a mistake. We want site ID, not client ID, excuse me. So site ID. All right, now we check on Webpack. Webpack is not crashing, so that's good. And then let's reload this, and then New York Daily News Sports, and then copy the feed URL. Make sure your console is open because we're looking for console log outputs down here. So we press add feed, and then here it is. So the feed was successfully created. Here's all the data from the backend. And if we go back to our Turbo dashboard and click on entities, you will see, if you click on this down here, let's reload it because I didn't see it. Now we see a feed option. If I click on that, you will see the feed that we just created. And that's it. So that worked. So that was successful, and we can click on the edit button here if we made a mistake. So if I click edit, you can change any of the contents that you need. And you can also delete it. So that's that. All right. So now that we've confirmed that this is successful, that this worked, what we really want to do is connect this to the Redux environment, because if you notice, we're maintaining state inside the component directly, which we really don't want to do. I mean, you can leave it like this. It just defeats the purpose of Redux. And we also don't have access to this data application-wide. It's sort of stuck inside this component. So in the next video, we're going to take this sequence and run it through the Redux cycle so that we can use Redux to maintain this state. So just to give you sort of a preview of how that's going to go, we're going to need to set up a reducer for a feed. So we'll have a feed reducer, set up an action to create the feed, and then connect this component to the Redux environment, or the store more accurately, and then as well as the actions, the dispatch action, and then we're going to call the action, which will update the reducer and then re-render the state. So yeah, all that's going to happen. So one thing I'm going to do right now, though, is I'm going to create a feeds array right here. And if you remember, each one of these represents a feed that we registered, right? So what we really want to do is have this loop through the feeds array. Like that. And then we want to return a list item for each one of these. And then for now, the href will just be hashtag, and then this will be feed.name, and then we have to add a key, feed.id. I believe it's called the name property. Yep, right there. So that's it. And then let's get rid of these. So now what we're doing here is we are only rendering the feeds from this array. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add the feed, let feeds object assign this state. Okay. And then we're going to add this to add the new one to the current state object, and then reset the state so that the list will update when you add a new feed. So right now you'll see that it's empty because I just removed everything. So if I do test and then test URL, I can add the feed and it pops up right here. So it worked. Of course, we don't really want that, right? That's just a test feed. So let's go back to our dashboard here and find it here and then get rid of it. Yes. Okay. Cool. So now we're good to go. So this component is pretty much ready to go for Redux. It's been properly set up. We tested it. We created a new feed. It rendered the new data right here. And like I was saying a few moments ago, we really want this to happen through the Redux sort of cycle. So in the next video, we're going to do all this through Redux. And yeah, that's it. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.